This is Dateline News and Conversation. We're back online after having to solve an intermittent internet problem. I figured it out, but I'm not going to give away my secret because it's embarrassing. My guest tonight's my good friend Eric Arnow from Chiang Mai, Thailand. He's an American, as you all were recalled. We're going to do a little history lesson tonight. How many of you, and you don't have to answer this, it's a rhetorical question, really know how far back Russia and US relations go? It may surprise some of you. Eric, you and I have talked about this before. Um, Goes all the way back to the time of Catherine the Great, 1776 or so. Take it away, my friend. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, the history here is Marx said something like history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So we know that the United States actually broke away from England. They had a problem with, they were colonists, and there was about roughly a third of the population didn't want to pay taxes to the king. So, like in 1763, there was something called the Boston Tea Party, where these guys, dissidents, got dressed up as Indians, and they went onto a ship that had a bunch of tea on it, and they threw the tea overboard as a protest against paying taxes. And then in 1970, there was a rebellion in Boston. 1975, I think the war actually started in 1976, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was declared, and you have these colonists, and they're just, they're trying to, hold out against the British Empire, and who helps them but Catherine the Great of Russia? And the reason why Catherine the Great helped them was because she kind of sympathized with them. They're this, what can I say? These naughty kids that are, rebelling against the king. And of course, Russia and England have had issues for centuries. So um, Catherine the Great was basically trading with them and helping them with supplies. And they also had a fleet. And at a certain point, it was, they basically said to England, don't mess with our ships because we're protecting them, and don't mess with us, or else you're going to have a war on your hands. So that was one thing. Then during the Civil War, British and the French were on the side of the South, and the reason for that is because they liked the idea of slavery. They had outlawed it in their own country, especially England outlawed it in its own country, but they thought it was just fine for these people in North America to have slaves. And of course, Abraham Lincoln had other ideas. So there was a civil war between the North and the South. And the British and French were actually going to block the ports, blockade the United States of America. So again, the I think it was Alexander II um, sent ships, and he said, don't mess with us because you're going to have a war on your hands. And so as a result, the because of the Russian support, the North was able to prevail over the South. But there was a really interesting quote. Let me see if I can find it here. This is really these Russians. They understood America pretty well actually back then. So this one guy, they were talking about this is during the Crimean War. So the United States was helping Russia during the Crimean War, which is 1853 to 1856. And of course, Crimea was being invaded by the British, the French, and the Turks. So you can see this war has been going. It's like been a perpetual war for centuries. But here's what the foreign minister of Russia had to say to some about the Americans. He said, "The Americans will go after anything that has enough money in it. They have the ships, the men, and the daring spirit, and the blockading fleet, that is the British, will have to think twice before firing on the Stars and Stripes." So basically, the Russians were protecting the United States. That was during the Civil War, and then he talked about um, this is a quote from some history. "It's rather improbable that the people of the South could be persuaded to form a new attachment to the Union," which is obviously true. And he said, this Russian guy said, he predicted an equally bleak future for relations between whites and the new freed men and women, that is the African slaves. He said, the Negro, the term they used at the time, the Negro will be tolerated only so long as he is useful to the Americans who, like all Anglo-Saxons, are always ready to speak piously about the rights of humanity, but are slow to put them into practice. That just, this is like 150, almost 200 years ago. The Americans have always been the same. They've always been hypocritical about human rights. Incredible. And Mark Twain had visited Russia, and he loved Russia. And Tchaikovsky came to the United States, and Tchaikovsky had a wonderful time in the United States, and they thought they were going to be friends forever. And mainly because they saw themselves as kind of counterpoints to British and French colonialism. So that's the background during the 19th century. But in the 20th century, things went rapidly south because of the Bolshevik Revolution. And, the capitalists just couldn't stand that. So in 1918, after the Bolsheviks they basically got control of what was called the provisional government. So the Tsar is overthrown in February of 1917. The First World War is going on. Lenin says to the Russian people, let's stop this war. We offer you peace, land, and bread. The Russian people decided that's what we want. And so they stopped the war. And as a result, Russia was, the new Soviet Union was attacked by not only dissidents within the Soviet Union, that these are basically the wealthy landowners and nobility and people like that, but also France, England, Japan, the United States, several other Czechoslovakia. They actually invaded the Soviet Union between 1918 and 1922. And fun fact, Winston Churchill, who was a high official, I think might have been like the Secretary of Defense. He launched attacks on the area around Leningrad and was using, guess what? Chlorine gas against Russian people in the Russian Civil War, which followed the start of the Soviet Union. So that created a lot of bad blood. Then you had World War II, and I want to quote some things from World War II because everybody thinks that the United States won World War II. But I'm going to quote some items here from a documentary that you can find on YouTube. And uh, it was the documentary was made in 1943, shortly after the fall of Stalingrad. That is the fall of the German military in Stalingrad. So this is the Secretary of the Navy, and he said, "We and our allies owe and acknowledge an everlasting debt of gratitude to the Army and people of the Soviet Union." George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. "The gallantry and aggressive fighting spirit of the Russian soldiers command the American Army's admiration." Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. "History knows no greater display of courage than that shown by the people of the Soviet Union." And this is Douglas MacArthur, who was one of the most famous generals. He says, "The scale and grandeur of the Russian effort mark it as the greatest military achievement in all history." And none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt presented a scroll to the people of Stalingrad in which he said, I present this scroll to the city of Stalingrad to commemorate our admiration for its gallant defenders whose courage, fortitude, and devotion during the siege of September 13th, 1942 to January 31st, 1943 will inspire forever the hearts of all free people. Their glorious victory stemmed the tide of invasion and marked the turning point in the war of the Allied nations against the forces of aggression. So, the idea that Russia has always been our enemy, which I think is something that the people who run the country like to inculcate in people's consciousness, is absolutely not true.
This is a history that has been completely whitewashed from the Western world, but especially in the United States of America. And they've been most aggressive in recent years in rewriting that history, completely ignoring and eliminating the contributions of the Soviet Union to World War II. But never do you hear it in any of the statements from any of our politicians for as long as I've lived about the history of the relationship between Russia, Imperial Russia, and the United States of America going back to the 1700s. So this is important for people to understand because, as you and I both know and agree, context is absolutely essential for understanding what is going on today. Now, Eric, I want to shift gears. I want to bring us up to date. Fast forward. There were high-level meetings in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, between Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio, newly appointed Secretary of State of the United States. It's been proclaimed as an enormous breakthrough by almost everybody. The Europeans are whining because they weren't at the table, but everybody else recognizes that for the security of the entire planet, it was absolutely essential for the United States and Russia to resume direct relationships. Out of that came the desire and promise to reestablish diplomatic relationships by reopening embassies and consulates and restaffing them to previous levels that is taking place today in Istanbul, Turkey. This is the main topic of discussion there. I'm sure there'll be other things that will be talked about. But before we continue, I would like your take as an American expat living for many years in Chiang Mai, Thailand, your thoughts on the significance of the reopening of relationships, direct contact on several levels between the United States and Russia. And I would like you to comment on the significance that it was Trump and Rubio that made the first telephone calls that led to the breakthrough. Your thoughts?
Well, it certainly is a step in the right direction. I mean, anything is better than, shutting down consulates. And the United States actually, they stole Russian diplomatic property. They have this idea of private property, and yet the United States commandeered Russian property. They physically took it away from Russia, which is just inexcusable. And of course, they shut down consulates, making it far more difficult for there to be interaction. I'll just mention on a historical note that in the 1980s, there was a great crisis in Europe over missiles in Europe. U.S. had Pershing missiles aimed at the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had missiles aimed at Europe. And when I was a monk at the Zen Center, a friend of mine and I went down to the San Francisco Soviet consulate, knocked on the door, They opened it up. They said, "Who are you?" We said, "We're a couple of monks. We want to talk with you." And the consul general spent a good hour with us discussing the problems. And this was, citizen diplomacy. The fact that the Soviet Union had the openness to talk with two complete strangers is remarkable. And it wouldn't have happened in last year or the year before because the U.S. had closed that consulate. So I think it is a great, it's a great step in the right direction. However, I know that there's a lot of skepticism about this opening because we've heard about resets in the past, and there's been a number of examples where U.S. policy blows hot and cold towards the Soviet Union and towards Russia. And my concern is that this isn't either a subterfuge by Trump and Rubio to uh, kind of put Russia off its guard and kind of disempower, and what would I say, psychologically disarm it with friendliness. And then later on, when the United States and Europe have rearmed, then ramp things up again. There's a Chinese saying, "A sword hidden in the smile." So Trump can smile and Rubio can smile and say, "Let bygones be bygones." But the history says that you can never be sure of the Americans in the West. They have a 500-year history of addiction to war and empire. And if they, will it be that easy for them to break that habit? Hard to say.
Yeah. I do think uh, it is hopeful uh, because um, at least they're talking to each other. And I think it was
Right.
one giant step backwards from nuclear annihilation, because that's really where we were. But at least now they're talking. I would like to add that I do not think that the Russians, in particular Putin and Lavrov, are naive to believe everything the United States says or does. They will be extremely cautious, I am sure. I think they've learned their lesson. We've discussed this previously with you and with other guests uh, about all the deception, all the breaking of agreements, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul. Uh, I think Russia has learned its lesson. So I think what we need to do is just step back and continue to observe what actually happens. As you mentioned, a smile and a sword. Words don't mean a whole lot, actions do. Now, Eric, a week or so ago, JD Vance attended the Munich Security Conference, and he did what I called a smackdown of the EU. He called them out for censorship, oppression of political parties. He called them out for a lack of democracy. He called them out for having lost their core values. Now, when I watched that, and I did, and I actually downloaded it and took notes, what was really striking, Eric, was that everything he accused the EU of, the United States has been the champion of for decades. It was so hypocritical in my mind. What were your thoughts? Although, Eric, I would like to say, I think it shook the rafters all across the EU. Your thoughts?
Well, the EU, um, what we have to understand, I try to look at things from a psychological point of view, a spiritual psychological point of view. And the people in Europe have a psychological problem. They're like the battered spouse, and the U.S. is the abuser. And whatever the U.S. does to them, they say yes, yes, yes. Well, it looks like things are changing a little bit, but I totally agree with you about this issue of the what I would call the psychological projection of the accusations that JD Vance made towards the EU. You know, he talks about democracy. Well, for crying out loud, you know, how many elections have been stolen? We've had how many presidents have been assassinated in the United States? Um, I was thinking just recently, who was it? Leonard Peltier, who was jailed for decades on trumped-up charges. Mumia Abu-Jamal is in jail for decades based on trumped-up charges. So the U.S. human rights record is nothing to be proud of, and the Russians even say it. You know, the Anglo-Saxons talk about human rights, but they don't follow them themselves. So this is and that's why I'm skeptical is because you're treating a neurosis slash psychosis in the mentality of the people who run our country.
Yeah. Eric, it was really amazing. Now, I want to fast forward to just yesterday and today. I'm sure you saw it in the top of the news. Katja Kallas, the Estonian new uh, foreign affairs minister for the EU, flew to Washington expecting to meet with Marco Rubio and members of Congress, and Rubio canceled the meeting, and she was not able, from what I have read, to gain access to too many members of Congress, if anybody. And so she went home with pie on her face. And then Macron today, I guess it was today, visits Trump in the White House, wanting all kinds of security agreements and a place at the table. And he left empty handed. And Eric, what are your thoughts? What's the message that the Trump administration is sending to the EU? Now, we know, and everybody knows, that he's been telling them, pay up, okay? We've been carrying you for 80 years. If you don't pay up, you're on your own. We might even pull out of NATO. And security in Europe is up to you guys. Eric, the message to me is pretty clear. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, again, um, I have a rather jaundiced view towards this whole thing. NATO was an extension of World War II. After World War II, the Soviet Union was devastated. They were just trying to get their country back together. And as we know, Winston Churchill in 1946 made his famous speech, "The Iron Curtain is falling." Well, was it the Soviet Union who put up the Iron Curtain, or was it the United States and England, the Anglo-Saxons that put up the Iron Curtain? They're always looking for trouble. And they say, we protected you and we put all this money in. Well, the Europeans, if they had any balls, would have said, there was no threat. If you want to stick all that money and waste it on weapons instead of giving your own people health care and free education and things like that, that we gave our citizens, that's your business. They could have said that, but they don't because they're in this subservient psychological mindset. But it is refreshing that this Katja Kallas, she's what can you say? I mean, I think she has Nazis in her background. These people are incredibly Russophobic, and apparently, for whatever reason, the Trump administration has decided that this is not productive, and the Europeans are on their own. And so this raises the question, well, why are they doing that? Is it simply because they've had a Jesus moment and they've decided they're going to be friends with Russia for the rest of our lives? Or is it that their real target is China and they have to direct their attention towards China and they realize that their war is lost? It's a, they made a They made a bad investment, cut your losses and move on and let somebody else pick up the pieces.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I want to talk about. Um, the Europeans have been screaming and trying to continue this war in Ukraine because if they don't defeat Russia in Ukraine, Russia will eventually take over all of Europe. Uh, the threat from Russia that they keep throwing at us and throwing out to justify the military spending and armament of Ukraine. Now, Eric, you're sitting up there in Thailand. I'm sitting over here in Crimea, and I, for the life of me, have to laugh at the stupidity of thinking that Russia wants to invade anybody when it has shown no signs, none, in 25 years to invade anybody. Forget about Chechnya, south of Ossetia, and Georgia. Those were something very different than attacking any member of NATO and the EU. Eric, it's ludicrous believing that Russia is a threat to them. Tell me what you think.
Um, again, the question is who's threatening who? When World War II happened and the Soviet Union got attacked and 27 million people died and they had to go all the way to Germany to root out the tumor, so to speak. Um, General Zhukov said, "We freed Europe from fascism and they will never forgive us." So who are the fascists? Who are the aggressors? Well, if you look at the 500 years of history of Europe, they are the ones who have been, terrorizing the planet. And people complain about Russia's human rights record, but when they expanded across Asia, they found themselves coming into contact with 100 different ethnic groups, and they didn't kill them. The United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand slaughtered those native peoples. So who's the human rights offenders here? Who's the threat? So again, this is again an example of psychological projection, where they project the threat onto Russia when in fact they're the ones who are expanding NATO, violating the agreements that they had with the Soviet Union that they wouldn't expand, and that's how they play the game. And the people living in the West, having been so subjected to this for decades, swallow this. So I say that they complained about the Chinese living behind the bamboo curtain and the Soviets living behind the Iron Curtain. And what they don't tell the people in the West is that we've been living behind the bullshit curtain for 80 years since World War II.
Yeah. I was a participant last week, uh, earlier this week, actually on Monday, in a roundtable. The topic was war journalism. And one of the comments that I made and I tried to impress on everybody is that we are living in the most, um, we're living in the most incredible information war, propaganda war in human history. It's overwhelming, it's ubiquitous. As you mentioned, it's been going on for decades, decades and decades. And what we're seeing now, I think, Eric, is not only that the majority of people in the US and the West are have been brainwashed, indoctrinated, but what we're seeing also, Eric, is that this information war, these psychological operations are overwhelming. I have several friends So do you, I'm sure, who are overwhelmed by the daily 24/7 nonstop echo chamber of news, fake news, disinformation, fact checking, etc., that it's causing many people to be depressed and to not be able to even sleep at night. We've been talking about US Russia relations. We've talked about these high level meetings between Lavrov and Rubio that are continuing today in Istanbul. We've been talking about the relations between the United States today and the EU and NATO. Now, I want to ask you this, because I know you've given it some thought. Rubio says that the dominant issue is that nations have national interest. I think Putin would say that. And maybe or maybe not, they coincide with other nations. In your mind, how would you translate this?
This gets to the core of the issue. When the United States says that nations have their own interests, what they don't understand and what the West doesn't understand is that they're so self-centered that they think that their interests are naturally contrary to other people's interests. They objectify other nations as simply inanimate objects on a chessboard to be rearranged to suit themselves. And those nations don't act according to what they think will happen because it's all taking place in a soap opera in their own mind, they go kind of crazy and they accuse, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. See, this is how they think. They
So,
don't understand. They don't understand is what's so interesting about the way Russians think and the way the Americans think is the Russians talk about collective security. We're all in this together. It's not the West against the rest. It's not our national interest, and maybe we can find something where we can agree on. They don't understand things. They think this is what we call dualistic thinking. You and me, good and bad, this kind of thinking. They don't get that. It's a psychological aberration of the West.
yeah. So the US is an empire then, and it has a psychological obsession or compulsion to dominate. That that
Right.
that that's been its history. And so what this really means when the United States enters into negotiations with any other country, in this case, Russia, uh, failure is built in because they lack real empathy. Would you like to add to that?
Well, you said it very well. Empathy is the ability to see things from another person's point of view and to not just see, but put oneself in the other person's shoes. So that when you're an empire, the way the U.S. is, and we talk about this U.S. American exceptionalism, it precludes the ability to have honest discussions with other people because you're always going to have, the West always has an ulterior motive.
Yeah. Um, you said something you wrote to me a while ago that the West sees everything as a game, the great
Right.
game, the grand chessboard. And you said those countries who were targets don't see it as a game, it's existential. And I think this is what we're seeing right now in Russia's relationships with the United States. For Russia, it's existential, it's a matter of survival. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. What is so striking and what can I say, disappointing. That's not even the correct word for it. Uh, the United States had this idea. Here's this geographical area. It's the borderlands of the former Russian Empire, otherwise known as Ukraine. And Russia has a lot of resources. We want those resources. So let's take this country, let's take this newly established country, because Ukraine basically only became independent of Russia post-Soviet Union. Let's take that country, weaponize it, and we'll use it to destroy Russia because that's what we do. We're an empire and we're just going to take Russia's stuff. So when you have that kind of mindset, everything is just pieces on a chessboard.
Yeah. Uh, you're mentioning Russia's resources, and you and I have talked about this. I have done shows about this and written articles about this. Um, the United States, like France, Napoleon, Germany, Hitler, have wanted and coveted Russia's resources. I think that's what it's all been about. And
Absolutely.
and in 1991, the United States, under George Herbert Walker Bush and um, Boris Yeltsin, entered into a relationship when they sent in the Harvard economists, the Harvard boys, Larry Summers and Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs had this idea of a shock therapy on the Russian economy after the fall of the Soviet Union. And this led to catastrophic results for the Russian people and the Russian nation. Because of this shock therapy, which led to the privatization of Russia's assets, it also created a class of oligarchs, Russian thieves, who took ownership of these assets and still hold them today. This privatization, this shock therapy on Russia led to more than 1 million deaths due to starvation and suicide, Eric. It led to the loss of jobs and wages for those who even had jobs. It led to a wave of violent crime all over Russia and the former Soviet republics. It led not only to deaths, but to alcoholism. It led to abortions. The average lifespan of a Russian man fell to 58 years. Now, this was all a result of Jeffrey Sachs' shock therapy on the economy, but his masters, George H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton, had different ideas. What they wanted was all of Russia's resources and the balkanization of Russia. That's the American imperialist DNA, to dominate, conquer, rape, and pillage. And Eric, I want to know how you feel, but I think that is one of the things behind this war of the United States against Russia in Ukraine. Joseph Biden has publicly declared it. So has Austin and the Pentagon. So has Blinken. The goal of the United States is the strategic defeat of the Soviet Union and the downfall of Vladimir Putin. Behind all of that is the lust for taking all of Russia's resources. What are your thoughts?
You know, as you know, I try to educate people through history. And one of the most important documentaries that I've ever seen, and I highly recommend people watch it, is called The Battle for Russia. And this documentary was made in 1943, and it talked about the first 3 years of the war, from its inception, from before its inception, the events leading up to it, up to the victory at Stalingrad. But in the very beginning, they say Russia has been invaded century after century after century. The Teutonic Knights in 1242, the Swedes, the Poles, all these countries. And then the question in this 1943 documentary says, why? Because Russia is rich. It has a lot of resources. This is 1943. They're admitting it openly. And at the time, the United States and Russia were allies, and the United States sympathized with the Soviet Union against the fascists. But the fact is that they gave away the game in 1943 with this documentary. And what you've said is just a continuation of the same imperial mindset. It's the same imperial mindset that caused the Americans to exterminate 90% of the native population on the North American continent, which itself had lots and lots of resources. But the people are extraneous, so it's okay to get rid of them. And that is the same mentality that they want to exercise on Russia.
Well,
The Russians are the new Native Americans. It's just another continent to conquer, get rid of the people and steal the stuff. That's how they think. This is just super predator mentality. This is like the mentality of like a Komodo dragon. All they see is, something to be taken and devoured.
yeah. Uh, so, Eric, the thinking of Trump, Rubio, and others now in Trump's circle um, is self-centered, is, I think you wrote, inherently psychologically unstable. Russia has said that the United States is agreement non-capable. Would you agree with that assessment of Trump? Forget about Biden now, he's long gone. But do you think that's true of Trump as well?
Well, again, when we look at, one of the reasons why I've never really taken Trump seriously is because I looked at his record as a business person. He was not a reliable business person. It's well documented. So the idea that this guy who has spent his whole life, I mean, who was his mentor? Roy Cohn, who was a mafia lawyer, you know, and somehow he's got this idea of altruism and let's all be friends and so on. It's very difficult for me to believe that he's sincere about that. I think there's an element, as I say, of there's a kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde mentality. I'm referring to a famous story by Edgar Allan Poe about this kindly doctor that everybody loves, but then he drinks this liquid and he becomes this terrible person. So with Trump, because he's so unpredictable, you don't know who you're actually talking to. There's an element, I'd say, of multiple personality here. And, it may sound a little extreme to say so, but when you look at the fluctuations in his attitudes and the things that he says, you have to really ask yourself, what is he really thinking? And can we really believe anything that he says?
Okay, so I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know if you do, but what does your crystal ball tell you about the coming days, months, and years of the Trump administration? What do you see coming in the future?
Um, the core issue facing the United States has nothing to do with other countries. It's all about how does the United States function as a society? This is a society that is deeply split on sociological levels, on economic levels, on ideological levels. This is a country which has massive homelessness. Its healthcare system is broken down. The lifespan is falling. And what is Trump doing? He's expanding. He's expanding the empire while neglecting his own being. It's like somebody who thinks that by I don't know, eating more junk food, they're going to be healthier. So the prognosis that I see is that the United States is going to deteriorate more and more as a society because the people aren't being taken care of. It's not even a question of Wall Street profits. It's a question of at a certain point a society collapses from within because it's the basic needs of maintaining it are not being met. And Trump does not understand that. Certainly, Elon Musk doesn't understand it. It's the whole basis of libertarian thinking that they don't understand that they have a responsibility to take care of the people, and without taking care of the people, they don't have a society.
Well, how do you reconcile that with Trump, uh, his Make America Great Again? Uh, he wants to restore jobs and prosperity to uh, working class middle America. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., uh, his Make America Healthy Again. So they're giving some appearances of caring about the people, but do you think this is just window dressing?
I think Robert F. Kennedy has certainly some of the right ideas. I think he was right about a lot of things, and if certainly the idea of making America healthy again is that's a worthy goal. Um, Whether they can pull it off in terms of instituting a national health care system that guarantees people to be actually taken care of without going into deep medical debt, are the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies going to go along with that? They're gonna have a fight on their hands. But the deeper issue for me is that the American population has been systematically dumbed down over the last 50 years. The educational standards have fallen so that the level of STEM, that is mathematics, science, technology, engineering, and math, are falling behind other countries. And if you're going to have a successful modern technology, it's not like just making cars and making simple stuff. You need a highly educated population in order to run these kinds of industries. And the question I have is are the educational standards going to make it? Let's go back to 1957. The Soviet Union, it's 12 years out past World War II. The country is devastated, and yet within 12 years, they launched the world's first satellite. And then they launched the first man in space. How are they able to do that? Because the Soviet education system was so superior. It took several failures for the U.S. to get a satellite into space. Now they're talking about the United States wants to commandeer TCMP, the Taiwanese semiconductor company. They want to bring the manufacturing facilities here. They can't find enough qualified, educated people to run the factory. So, without a really educated population and a healthy population, it's like having a chain around your legs. It's going to be very difficult. And I don't hear them talking about that. So
Well, what
yeah.
about uh, Elon Musk, DOGE, Department of Government Deficiency, got a lot of fanfare immediately. USAID was basically shut down, shuttered. I
Hmm.
thought that was a great thing because someone who's
Hmm.
living in another part of the world, I've seen the direct effects of USAID on government coups, uh, educating future generations of different countries, former Soviet republics, uh, to buy into that American dream narrative. Uh, they wanted to. I don't know if it's happened, but Trump wanted to do away with Department of Education. I personally thought that was a great thing. Turn that back into the hands of the states, of local organizations, the way it's been run since the founding of this country. There was no Department of Education. Um, you know, um, there are other efforts um, to undermine what they refer to as the deep state, which is this bureaucratic bureaucratic class that's been entrenched in American government and society, for I don't know, forever. I mean, how can anybody be against that? And
I yeah, yeah, I agree.
so
Well, I think
go
go
ahead, go
ahead.
ahead.
Um, I think that the deep state has this kind of two components to it. One is the bureaucracy, the government bureaucracy, which, keeps everything running kind of on an inertia, so to speak. And without that government bureaucracy that goes from one administration to the next, there would be no continuity. You need some continuity. But of course, there's a continuity of corruption that is also going on. But that's one aspect of it. So the military, industrial, congressional, academic think tank complexes Ray McGovern talks about, that's an aspect of the deep state. But the other aspect of the deep state is the super oligarchic class, who is basically controlling things, from above, and making use of these tools to, accomplish their goals of creating a country that is in the state that it's in now. Now, specifically regarding DOGE, there's no doubt that there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. We know that the Pentagon has not passed an audit since 2001. In September 10th, 2001, Donald Trump gave a news conference in which he said there was $2.3 trillion missing. And the next day, 9/11 happens, and that whole investigation went down the memory hole. Now they say there's $23 trillion missing.
Yeah,
They
that
can't
was,
account
I
for.
think
So
that was Donald Rumsfeld.
Donald Rumsfeld, yeah, excuse me, Donald Rumsfeld. He's correct about, so that's true about that. Um, but on the other hand, Trump says, well, we need an Iron Dome missile defense. So how much is that going to cost? So you cut a lot of spending, by the millions or the tens of millions from certain um, government agencies that are not useful, or there's waste, fraud, and abuse going on. And then you set up this whole new program of the Iron Dome, which is going to cost billions and billions of dollars. And where does the savings go? I wrote a letter to Donald Trump. I said, forget the Iron Dome. Build schools, hospitals, an education system, a healthcare system that takes care of the people. If you want to, and a mass transportation system. China, all over the world, people have these incredible mass transportation systems that you can go anywhere, and it's very inexpensive, and it's fast, and it's clean, and it's wonderful. We don't have that in the United States. So before you talk about these grandiose plans of just cutting all the fat, you got to think about what's going to really improve the U.S. economy, and that means investing in the infrastructure, And has Donald Trump talked about creating a transit system? Has he talked about just replacing the plumbing in New York, which is 100 years old and is leaking? Are they talking about any of that? I don't know. I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, you mentioned the U.S. as a functioning society, um, and I think that's exactly where it is in the United States. It's no longer a functioning society. You've mentioned the educational system is so far behind the rest of the world. Uh, you've mentioned a lack of attention to the infrastructure, to new uh, fast rail systems replacing Amtrak, which has been and is a disaster, replacing bridges that are no longer safe to cross, um, the healthcare system, people going bankrupt because of a health event. And then, Eric, when you talk about a functioning society, I'm trying to be fair and objective, but make America great again really exposes an enormous divide in the American public. The I mean, I think that we are in a non-shooting civil war. A country so divided over some of these basic fundamental core beliefs and values that I don't think MAGA is able to address those issues. In fact, I think it's been very divisive. The people on the other side are unforgiving, disbelieving, unwilling to participate. And so what we end up with is what you said, the United States is a functioning society. Now, Eric, I want to finish on this note. I think you recognize that in Thailand. I recognize that here living in the Russian Federation in Crimea. I am absolutely certain that the Russians in the Kremlin, Putin and Lavrov, and whoever is in their inner circle know very well the situation in the United States of America right now as a functioning, reliable society and partner. Your concluding thoughts on that?
That is the question. I spoke with Putin yesterday for about 2 hours. Just kidding. I have no idea what's going on in his mind. On the one hand, I think this guy is incredibly naive. How could he have let the Minsk agreements go for 8 years without doing anything about it? And he even admitted it. But on the other hand, I think slowly but surely the realization is sinking in that they need to be very, very careful about the agreements that they make with the United States, and it may be that they're and China are playing the long game and they're waiting for the U.S. to implode. That's one scenario that they're probably considering.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I want to thank you so much. This has been a very interesting and exciting and in-depth conversation. We've covered some ground that not too many people are talking about. Um, we'll look forward to doing it again real soon.
Okay, great. It's been really wonderful talking with you, and I will see you soon in a couple of months in Moscow.
Yes, we're looking forward to it.